To stack or not to stack? That is the question. A question to which my answer is usually an automatic yes, but it really shouldn't be. Let's talk about the pros and cons of focus stacking in macro photography. But for those of you really confused right now, focus stacking involves taking several images of your subject at different points of focus, then combining those into a single image to achieve more depth of field. There are several ways to perform this, and we're not going to go into details in this video, but essentially, the traditional way would have been to use a focus rail. Then you could also move your camera towards your subject while doing a burst, or you could hold your camera still, do a burst, and then rotate the focus ring. Or probably the most common way these days is using a focus bracketing feature that some cameras have. So let's start with the pros, and one really big one, and honestly there really isn't that many pros as you'll see in this video, but yeah, the one really big one is focus stacking allows you to achieve more depth of field without sacrificing image quality or detail. Or you could say the other way around, you can achieve more detail without sacrificing depth of field. And you can do all this while having more control over separating your subject from your background. If you've tried any macro photography, then you know that at high magnifications, depth of field is very shallow. Now, I think you could make the argument that one of the more appealing aspects of macro photography is being able to show people things they cannot see with their bare eyes, right? So, have you seen what an ant's eye looks like? I have. It's not that interesting, but at least I know that. So I think you can definitely make an argument that there is value to having a good amount of details in macro photos. And I think you can also make it an argument that there's value to having more depth of field. Probably don't want to just show someone a photo with a sliver of an eye in focus and call that a photo, although I am guilty of having done that before. Now you might be asking yourself, why don't you just stop down the aperture, right? Pretty basic photography. However, once you stop down the aperture past a certain f-stop, it really depends on the lens, but essentially diffraction kicks in and your lens doesn't perform as well. You start losing sharpness, and then obviously if you decrease your magnification, if you move away from the subject, then you're having to crop more, so you're losing detail that way as well. Now, I was able to only come up with one other pro of focus stacking, and it's a pretty stupid one and very subjective, but you could argue that it's kind of cool, It's like driving stick in North America. Not everyone can do it, because there's a bit of a barrier to entry. You could argue there's a little bit of prestige that comes with it. So I think, if your life is sad and you can get a little bit of an ego boost from this, then I think it's worth something, right? Having said that, I have come across people who have said things like, oh, these days cameras can do focus bracketing, so focus stacking is pretty easy. And all those people seem to have one thing in common. None of them focus stack. So I just thought of one more pro, and again, it's a pretty subjective one, and not everyone's going to agree with this, but I happen to find editing focus stacks pretty relaxing for some reason. It's probably the closest to meditation that I'm ever going to get. Just get in the zone and time flies by. It's just stimulating enough, but it doesn't require much cognitive effort. And in the end, you feel somewhat productive. And I should add that I absolutely hate cleaning in real life, but somehow here it's just satisfying. Probably because once you clean it, it stays clean, not like my apartment. Now, moving on to the cons, we'll start with one that's probably, the biggest issue for me, and that it's actually quite easy to end up with unnatural looking photos when doing focus stacking. It could be due to the subject moving, but most commonly the culprit is unnatural looking focus fall off. Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot more can go wrong that will ruin your image. When you're shooting single shots, you're worried about basic photography stuff like focus, exposure, composition. With focus stacking, there's a lot more to worry about. Like for example, missed frames resulting in gaps. Subject movements are a very common reason for failure of stacks. If you're shooting live subjects, some of them don't like to sit still for a very long time, so you have a very short window of opportunity sometimes. Aside from subject movements, there could be movements introduced by you or the environment. Maybe you got shaky hands, maybe there's wind blowing or whatever. Flash can be inconsistent in between shots. This has happened to me many times, especially if you like push your flash really hard and it starts overheating, then it can kind of perform unpredictably. And it's pretty annoying if you've got one shot in a stack that's much brighter or darker than all the others. And then obviously you have to worry about if the image works as a stack. In the end, does it look good or does it look weird? Now, there are definitely more costs incurred with focus stacking. Probably the biggest one is that it is more time consuming, and is more time consuming on so many different levels of the process. So taking the photo itself definitely takes longer. If you're using like a focus rail, obviously that's going to take forever. But for most of us, let's say best case scenario, you have a camera with focus bracketing that's pretty quick. You're still, instead of taking 1 or 2 shots, to nail the focus, you're taking 5, 10, 20, 50, 100, maybe 300 photos, which obviously takes quite a bit of time. And then, let's say halfway through that stack, your subject moved. So then you got to start all over again. And then, the second time, like maybe there is some movement, but you're not really sure. Like you think you got it, but maybe not. So, let's try it again. And just to be sure, let's just do another attempt, just to rule out the possibility of failure, right? Make sure you have it in the bank. And then your flash overheats because you've been pushing your flash too hard, and then you got to wait for your flash to cool off. And yeah. Now, I might be projecting just a little bit. You might be more confident in your skills, but I have a little bit of OCD and I have been burnt many times. And then you get home and then it's time to copy over your gazillion photos onto your computer. That's definitely going to take longer than it would if you were doing single shots. Then when it's time to actually work on your focus stacks, the actual aligning process and the stacking of the images through software, that can take some time. It really depends on the number of photos in your stack, how fast your computer is, the resolution of your images. A lot comes to play, but it could be as little as a couple of seconds or it could be a few minutes. But now remember, maybe you did take a lot of stacks of the same thing over and over again because you weren't sure if you get it right. So now you have to pick like the best one from that, and you don't really know the best one until you stack all of them and then kind of compare. Then comes the part of obsessing which shots to include in your focus stack, because that might have a dramatic impact on your final image. And then we're on to the most time-consuming part, which is the editing. So essentially you're going in and you're correcting all the spots where your focus stacking software chose the wrong frame for a given area. And then you're going to have to also do some fixing of haloing. Depending on the shape of your subject and the magnification, it might be a lot or it might be very little. Or maybe you might not actually have to fix any haloing at all. It really depends. Now, I'm not particularly good at the editing and the cleanup, so maybe it takes me a little bit longer than it does some people. But if I'm working on a high magnification image of, let's say 100 frames, it takes me a few hours. So I'm spending a few hours per image sitting there trying to make an insect look pretty. It's a tough thing to explain to people, that might be why I'm single. Now, you could skip out on some of this time-consuming correction stuff and, I see some people do it all the time. In fact, I've posted some sloppy stacks myself. And you might think you're getting away with it because nobody's gonna call you out on it to your face. We're not jerks in the macro community, but just know that there are weirdos out there like myself who are watching and judging you. And I think you want to actually remember why you're doing this. If you're doing focus stacking because you want to get more details, but you can't really show off those details, you can't really crop or zoom in into your images because your stacks look nasty, then that kind of defeats the purpose of focus stacking, right? You might as well just keep it simple and do single shots. Now, there are some additional costs that you might be tempted to incur, like more monetary ones, like for example, you might be tempted to upgrade your SD cards to ones that are bigger and faster because if you're doing a lot of bursts or bracketing, you need a fast SD card. You're also taking tons and tons of images, so you gotta be able to store them. Same thing for, disk space. You might be tempted to upgrade your machine because focus stacking software can be resource hungry, especially when it comes to memory. I had to upgrade the RAM in my machine. You may also be tempted to upgrade your camera body. When I upgraded to a camera with focus bracketing system, my success rate with stacks just increased dramatically. And there's some other features which some cameras lack, which make a difference with focus stacking, like buffer size, being able to do flash with bursts. Surprisingly, not every fairly new camera can do this. Something else to consider is if your camera doesn't support flash with electronic shutter, you're going to be racking up that shutter count much quicker than you would with single shots. So the wear and tear on your camera is definitely going to be accelerated. And speaking of flash, you are going to need better flash than you would for single shots. For single shots, just any cheap flash will do usually. You can just crank up the power or whatever. But if you're doing stacks, you're repeatedly doing bursts, so you're going to need something with a fast recycle time, so something with a lithium-ion battery or external lithium-ion battery pack. Another big con is you're a little bit more limited in terms of what you can shoot. Basically, you're generally going for stationary subjects. This means you could be missing out on some interesting and dynamic action shots. To do that, that means you're probably going out to shoot at ridiculous times when they're sleeping and not very active. This probably means that maybe you're not getting good sleep yourself, which could have health side effects. Now this one's fairly subjective, but not everyone likes that stacked image aesthetic. Single shots have more bokeh, and who doesn't love bokeh, right? But is more bokeh more better? Some people seem to think so. Some people love those creamy, dreamy images with only a tiny bit of the subject in focus, super shallow depth of field. Some people seem to think of these as more artistic, which I find hilarious, but at the same time I'm pretty biased because I realize that those bokeh-licious images are much easier to pull off than ones with more depth of field. But in other genres of photography, let's say portrait photography, really shallow depth of field that often is associated with expensive lenses with wide apertures. So, in macro, bokeh is cheap, but in other places it's not. And I guess the final con is that focus stacking requires a bit more skill and knowledge. So there's a bit of a barrier to entry there. I'd say it requires a bit more practice. With single shots, assuming you get the gear right, the flash and the diffuser, you can kind of get lucky here and there, and that can be encouraging for you. But with focus stacking, chances are your first stack is not going to be really good. I mean, at least my early attempts were not very good, which can be discouraging for some. And it's all I can think of in terms of pros and cons. Do you guys agree, disagree? Did I miss anything obvious? Hope you got something out of it. I know myself, it's been kind of good to reevaluate my photography habits. I'm not planning on stopping stacking anytime soon, but I do hope to do more single shots in the future. If you are interested in macro photography and focus stacking in particular, there will be more videos regarding that. But I think they'll be a little bit different than this one. It's going to be more along the lines of like my dumb photography inventions. So if that sort of stuff might interest you, then you may want to consider subscribing. Maybe that's notification bell. No? Okay, I don't want to push it. Anyways, thanks for watching. Take care.